Bore da pawb a croeso cynnes iawn i'r ail seminar yn ein cyfres ar yr economy sylfaenol. Good morning everybody and a warm welcome to our second event in the series on the foundational economy. First of all, I need to say apologies for the late start. We're experiencing a little technical difficulties, and we're still having those difficulties, but we thought we should move ahead and see if we can sort those out as we go along. My name is Ian Rhys-Jones and I'm the director of the Wizard Civil Society Centre. And as many of you know, we have been awarded an ESRC Centre grant to continue a programme of work on civil society, specifically focusing on civic stratification and civil repair. And a major part of that work is going to focus on the foundational economy, and part of it will involve an international series of conferences and colloquia addressing different aspects of the foundational economy. And our hope was to have one of those this year in Cardiff, but as you know, events have overtaken us. But the intention is that we can bring together academics, practitioners, policymakers and politicians to discuss different aspects of the foundational economy. And I'm really excited about these virtual events over the next 3 days, because I think we're achieving that. And I'm particularly excited about listening to our speakers today. Now, before I hand over to our chair, Carol Williams, just to note, the event is being recorded. Attendees won't be recorded because of the system, but you will be able to listen back at a future date to the speakers and the discussion on the Wizard website. And we really want it to be a discussion today. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a thing called the Q&A. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, if you can click on that and type in your questions at any point. If you want to actually ask the question or contribute a comment yourself, just preface your question with the word talk, and we will arrange it so that you can come into the meeting and be part of it that way. Otherwise, Carol, as chair, will be able to ask the question on your behalf. There will also be a short break before we start the Q&A and discussions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carol Williams to present today's session.
Good morning, Boreda. I'm your chair for this morning, and the session is really about two questions. How can alternative thinking and policies gain traction in the aftermath of COVID-19? What do we do differently to build back better, as the cliche has it? And specifically, our foundational priorities and policies such as universal basic services and universal basic income about to become mainstream? Is there a possibility of a radical turn? And we have today got two distinguished, what you might call crossover speakers, who've moved between the worlds of ideas and of practice, and in different ways are both involved in rethinking centrist social democracy. And for those of you who aren't entirely familiar, I'll just briefly describe the two speakers. Rachel Reeves is Labour MP for Leeds West, formerly chair of the Business, Energy and Industry Select Committee, where many of you who are British will have seen her holding the government to account. She returned to the shadow cabinet under Keir Starmer, where I think she stands out as the member who's most interested in ideas. She is, of course, the author of the Everyday Economy pamphlet, and now is well placed to influence Labour Party thinking and policy as it develops in the next few months. So there we have a frontbench politician who's interested in ideas. Fabrizio Barca is crossover in the opposite direction. He's a working academic who's taught at many European universities, but he's also been actively engaged in policy in many ways. Engaged through research at the Bank of Italy, as author of a major EU report on territorial cohesion, and as a minister in the technocratic Monti government of 2013. Fabrizio is politically aligned with the Democratic Party, and he's organizer of the DD group in Italy, the Forum on Inequality and Diversity, which has just published its manifesto for Italy after COVID-19. So there's the questions. Can we see a progressive turn after COVID-19? There are two speakers who cross over, and now for the running order and the housekeeping. Rachel Reeves will speak first, and Fabrizio will speak second. Each has 20 minutes. And then the plan was to take a 5-minute break before Q&A. But I need to talk to Rachel when she is up as our first speaker, because I think Rachel now has to be away by 11 o'clock. So it might be an idea not to run all the Q&A after both speakers, but to allow you to question Rachel before she has to skip for more important business later in the morning. If you want to ask your question, here's the drill again, which is to repeat what Ian said a few minutes ago. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A box. You can type your question into the box while the speakers are speaking. If you add talk, you can ask the question yourself. If you don't add talk, I will actually ask the question for you. For those of you who are BBC Radio 4 listeners, this is basically Gardner's question time, but it's not about growing marrows, it's about the future of social democracy. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Rachel, and as Rachel has to leave at 11 o'clock, I think, Rachel, if it's okay by you, we'll take the questions, some questions for you after your 20-minute pitch, so that at least there is some interaction with the audience. Does that make sense?
Great.
Okay, Rachel, 20 minutes, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, and to Ian and you for inviting me. I can assure you I would much rather be spending the next 2 hours with all of you than be sitting on a shadow cabinet subcommittee. But that is my my duty at 11 o'clock today. So I'm sorry that I won't be able to be here for the whole thing. And it's a real pleasure to be on this in this discussion with Fabrizio as well. As Carol alluded to at the beginning, I've spent 10 years, just over 10 years, as a member of the British Parliament now. The first 5 years I was on the front bench, the next 5 I was on the back bench, and in April this year I returned to the front bench again. So I've seen things in a way from different perspectives. One thing that I regretted in my first 5 years in Parliament, when I served in the shadow cabinet in different positions, was that doing a job like that afforded very little time for thinking. And so when I returned to the backbenches, I made sure that I did make time for that. And that's how I got to know Carol and the excellent work of the Foundational Economy Collective. And over those years, I did quite a lot of thinking about the rise in populism, the decline in social democracy, and thinking more fundamentally about what matters to people's lives and why those of us on the centre left have struggled to make those connections with what Carol refers to as the foundational and I refer to as the everyday. What do I mean by that? I mean the things that matter in our everyday lives, our families and our close friends, the places that we live, and a sense of pride in those and the identity that they provide us with, and the work that we do. Is it meaningful? Does it give us the security that most of us crave? Coronavirus has in many ways added an additional dimension to this. I wrote in my pamphlet, The Everyday Economy, that the everyday economy were those parts of the economy without which the rest of society and the wider economy would not be able to function. Perhaps it was a bit abstract when I wrote it, but during the course of the last few months, we can be in no doubt about what those everyday or foundational parts of our economy are. They are health and social care, they are distribution, they are supermarket workers. They are those parts of the economy that if people didn't turn up to work, the rest of society wouldn't be able to function. Keir Starmer said in his acceptance speech when he was elected as leader of the Labour Party that those people are often underappreciated and undervalued. They are also underpaid. We need an industrial strategy, an economic strategy, and a political strategy that better connects with the everyday rather than just with the abstract. So in the next 15-20 minutes, I want to say a little bit about what that means. First of all, it means that Labour cannot be the party of the status quo. People are crying out for change. They're crying out for change because their living standards have been declining for 10 years. Their sense of identity and sense of place have been undermined by rapid change in many of our communities. And they're crying out for change because they feel that they have been neglected. I read a wonderful quote recently, which I think sums it up well. An LSE geographer has called the populist surge of the last 5 years the revenge of the places that don't matter. Well, those places do matter, and the people who live there do matter. And we need to better connect with their hopes, their fears, and their aspirations. Second, we need to strengthen our resilience. What do I mean by that? Well, I think it can be seen at 3 levels. The resilience of families and individuals, the resilience of communities, and the resilience of the nation state. And we've seen through the pandemic, certainly here in the UK, that after 10 years of Conservative government and 10 years of austerity, our resilience, both as families, as communities, and as a nation, have been sorely tested, and they have been found wanting. As we entered this crisis, rough sleeping in the UK was up 141% in a decade, and 11.5 million of our fellow citizens had less than £100 in savings. So people were not resilient. More than 1 million people now, a record number of UK workers, are on 0-hour contracts. So they don't know from 1 week to the next, or in some cases from one day to the next, whether they will have work and how much they will take home that week. That makes it incredibly hard to plan for the future. And as a result, families and individuals going into this crisis were not resilient in the face of job losses and declines in income. And they weren't resilient when they were told to self-isolate because they had symptoms or because they needed to shield. And if they were in 0-hour contracts or in other insecure work, they often weren't paid. So we need to build an economy that is more resilient for families. We also need more resilient communities. In Leeds, where I'm an MP, the council established hubs in the 33 wards or districts of our city. Those hubs, although they were funded by the local authority, were run by community networks, volunteers essentially, to distribute food to people who needed it, whether because they couldn't afford it or because they were shielding and were not able to access the supermarkets as they might usually be able to. They also tended and cared for the lonely and those who were socially isolated, and ensured that people got the support that they needed. I believe that those hubs and those networks need to be continued when this pandemic eventually comes to an end, because our communities were not resilient going into this crisis. Many local authorities now stand on the brink of bankruptcy because of what they have faced over the last few months. Our communities are not resilient. But our nation state isn't resilient either. How could we in the UK, the 6th richest country in the world, find ourselves in a position that we were not even being able to produce the personal protective equipment and clothing to keep those people working on the front line and those who they cared for protected? We were in that position because over the last 3 decades, our manufacturing sector and our textiles industries have been all but destroyed. And we're in that position because the British government have, for many years now, not had anything approaching a proper functioning industrial strategy to ensure that we were able to be self-sufficient and produce both food and also other essentials rather than relying on imports. And again, when tested, our system was on the verge of collapse. The third thing I would say is that people matter and that human contact matters. When I served on the backbenches, one of the things I did was to chair all-party select committee, the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, in memory of my friend and colleague Joe Cox, who was murdered by a neo-Nazi in her constituency in 2016. Joe worked in many different parts of the world in international development, but that didn't mean that she didn't notice a different type of crisis here at home, a crisis, an epidemic, if you will, of loneliness and social isolation in so many of our communities, and not just amongst the old. That loneliness epidemic has grown in recent years as families and communities have fragmented, as places where people come together, whether that be in trade unions, in working men's clubs, in pubs, in community centres, in libraries. So many of those institutions have been cut back or no longer resemble what they once were. High streets as well have been, in many ways, hollowed out, with empty shop fronts and high street names abandoning town streets and high streets around the country. Those places for human interaction have declined, and Labour and the social democratic left need to talk about that and have policy responses to it as well. But fourth, I want to say something about change and how we plan for it. I mentioned previously about industrial strategy. We need an industrial strategy for our national economy to make us more resilient. We also need an industrial strategy for those parts of the foundational or everyday economy where many people work, where most people work, in all parts of the country, but has been neglected. And I don't think it's any surprise that those foundational parts of the economy that are often the lowest paid and employ a disproportionate number of women are those parts of the economy that are most neglected when it comes to industrial strategy. We've all seen industrial strategies for pharmaceuticals, for high-tech manufacturing, for the automotive sector, for green energy and green industries. And those are welcome, although they need more permanence and more long-term strategy and thinking. But very rarely do you see an industrial strategy for social care or an industrial strategy for the retail sector or for distribution. But if we had an industrial strategy for those sectors, more people would benefit, more people would be in line for earning wages that they could afford to live in, and it would have a greater impact on our productivity. As Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, has said, we need to tackle our long tail of unproductive or low productivity firms in the UK, and yet our industrial strategy very rarely speaks of or speaks to people who work in those sectors of the economy. Fifth, jobs really matter. And what matters is, of course, the quantity of jobs, whether you have a job or not, but it's also about the quality of work. About a year ago, I wrote a pamphlet with one of our trade unions, the GMB, called Everyday Work, interviewing people, particularly in the Yorkshire region, where I'm a member of Parliament, about their experience of work in the public sector, in the private sector, in a whole range of industries and occupations. But whatever industry and whatever occupation, the same issues came up time and time again. Whether people felt that they had a voice in the workplace, whether their work conferred meaning, whether they felt they were making a difference, whether they had security, whether there are opportunities to progress and develop in your role. And for far too many people, not just in the UK, but across the developed world, work has often lost its meaning, and many people feel that they have lost their voice in the workplace. So those are just some of the issues that I think make the concept and the ideas from the Foundational Economy Collective so important. The foundational helps us to understand and to focus on what matters in our lives and in our communities. Coronavirus and the pandemic that we've been confronted with over the last few months, I think, is a further proof point of the importance of the foundational or the everyday. In the last decade, governments, and particularly the British government, have made cuts and they've taken shortcuts which have hollowed out our state, have made us less resilient, and have made it harder to face what we have just gone through. The constant focus on outsourcing, of getting value for money, where it often provides nothing of the sort. When I chaired the Business Select Committee, as Carol mentioned previously, I led the inquiry into the collapse of outsourcing giant Carillion. Governments outsource because they say it delivers better value for money and for innovation, that it outsources the risk, but it doesn't. Because when things fail, the government always has to pick up the pieces. And when money is saved, it is often at the expense of workers, subcontractors, and people saving for their pensions. The foundation also speaks to the communities that we live in, our high streets, the places where we come together, the public services that often bind us together. People want change, but at the same time, they want security and they want certainty. They want to feel some control over their lives. In England, the Tories promised that. In Scotland, the SNP are. People have been trying to tell Labour, particularly in former industrial towns and communities across the country, that they want Labour to change. But we haven't listened, and we've paid the electoral price. We've now 4 consecutive losses in a row. We need an economy and a society built on stronger foundations, focusing on the things that matter in our everyday lives, family and close friends, the places we live and whether we feel a sense of pride in them and identity. Jobs that are meaningful, that give our lives meaning and connection, and jobs that provide the security that most of us crave. Some seek to divide, and populism seeks to divide. That is not the Labour way, and it's not the social democratic way. But it poses us with a problem. We need policies that bridge the divides between young and old, the divide in the United Kingdom between Remain and Leave, between town and city, between graduates and non-graduates. We need a vision and we need an empathy of the people who we hope to serve again. We want to transform our countries and communities, and that's why we need to listen to the people who we hope to serve again. I think a focus on the foundational and the everyday is a route into that, to build a more resilient families, neighbourhoods and countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Now, we're going to ask you a few questions, and I'm going to start by bringing in Ian, then one of our attendees, Celia, and then Kevin. Ian, over to you, where you have a question really about timescales and what happens when, Ian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. That was really interesting, and I'm so pleased that towards the end you flagged up the problem of outsourcing. But my question really is about local social infrastructure, and I agree with you that we really need an economic strategy that invests in local social infrastructures. But as we've seen, these are things that are quite easy to destroy quite quickly, but very difficult to build back up again, and difficult to see the benefits and outcomes that arise from that investment. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what your political strategy can do to bring citizens on board for what are long-term projects.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. And yeah, I mean, the destruction of that sort of social infrastructure is something that we very much see in my constituency in Leeds, where many of our community centres, which were previously focal points for the community, if they are still there, they've been so hollowed out with so few services there, and others have closed their doors completely. It's the same with other places where people come together. Many libraries in Leeds have closed, although the ones that are remaining are thriving and doing well. The first years of austerity saw the local council look to close leisure centres. One of them in my constituency is now run by the community. It's been really tested by lockdown because without local authority and state support behind it, it is really hard when faced with lockdown and having to close your doors for several months. I think part of the answer on this is more devolution. I think decisions being made closer to where people live will result in better decision making. But devolution that's a bit different from what we have seen under the sort of Osborne city deal model. There's a couple of problems, I think, with that. First of all, it often controls power in a sort of anchor city rather than devolving power to the towns and neighbourhoods on its periphery. And sometimes people feel almost as disconnected from that city as they do from Westminster. And so I think that model of devolution needs to be more attuned to the neighbourhoods and the communities in which we live and the decision makers in those communities. But also what we've seen is a devolution of delivery, but not usually a devolution of power. And so you've got a devolution to Greater Manchester or the Sheffield City region or Birmingham, West Midlands. But all it is the mayor having the responsibility of implementing rather than being able to make decisions on behalf of the areas that they represent, and constantly in battle with government about money being handed down rather than powers to raise money locally. So I think there are two sort of key problems with the devolution settlement that this government has used, and Labour will need to develop, and that's what we'll be doing over the next 4 years, some form of alternative to that. Let me just link as well, Ian, to the point you made at the beginning about outsourcing. It's another example of how the government are not really serious about devolution and local decision making. because at the beginning of this crisis, local directors of public health and academics and experts in public health said for contact tracing particularly, but also for testing, let local authorities, let local communities run it. And the government, of course, said, no, we know best. We will devolve this to Serco to do. And we will hand over hundreds of millions of pounds to these big outsourcing companies to deliver essential public services. And first of all, it costs a huge amount of money, and it's been done with no transparency or oversight or competition. But second, it just hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked for all the reasons that people said it wouldn't work in the first place. That Serco has no connection with communities in Bolton or in Leicester or in Caerphilly or in other places where there are now, as we're seeing, large local spikes in the virus. And I was speaking to Andy Burnham last week, and he said that in Oldham and in Bolton, Serco are contacting only just over half of the contacts that they've been provided by people who have tested positive for the virus. And in Oldham, they're now recruiting volunteers to go door to door to do that contact tracing. And what Andy said is, it is absolutely galling that Serco have been handed millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, that people are being paid to work in call centres and are not making any calls. And yet in Oldham, they're having to recruit volunteers, not getting paid, the council not being resourced to do it, because that is the only way to bring the virus under control. And so although the government talks about devolution, their whole approach through this pandemic is to have a few clever men in the centre direct everything and neglect the local expertise and knowledge that is embedded in all of our communities.
Thank you, Rachel. Here's another question from one of our attendees, Celia. And Celia asks whether a real living wage could be a driver for resilience. In other words, she's asked, returning to one of your themes, which was the corrosive effect of low and irregular wages. And I suppose one could then say, in a way rather unkindly, we're all against low and irregular wages, so what could and should the Labour Party do about it, compared with a rather half-hearted Matthew Taylor approach to 0 hours? Is it productivity that should be raised? Is it restrictions on employers' casualization of the workforce? What mix of policies and what benefits would derive from a real living wage?
Well, thank you, Celia, for that question. I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the government are now saying that they need to look at the forthcoming planned increase in the national living wage for whether it's affordable, and suggesting that that may not happen next year. And I think that would be a big mistake, because as I said in my opening remarks, 11.5 million people have got less than £100 worth of savings. And it's not because people suddenly change their preferences about whether they want to save or not. It is largely because so many people aren't earning enough to save, but also they don't have the security of work to be able to save. So if you are one of the 1 million people on a 0-hour contract, it's very difficult to regularly save if you don't know what you're going to be earning from one week to the next. And so you can't set up a direct debit to save into a credit union or into a regular savings account or anything like that. And if you do build up savings, it will be to cushion you for the weeks that you don't get work, rather than to plan for the future. So I think it's twofold. It's about the wages that people earn, but also about the security of those wages. And I think that we need to address both of those. Just increasing people's wages but not addressing the insecurity, I think, would be insufficient. So I think it's necessary to look at wages. I think something like still 20% of people are paid less than a real living wage. 25% of women who are paid less than a real living wage. I think I'm right in saying that something like half of people who work in a social care setting earn less than a real living wage, and a quarter of people who work in a social care setting are on 0-hour contracts. So we've got people doing some of the most important work in our society, caring for our loved ones, keeping them safe at the moment in the face of terrible adversity and terrible risks, and we're not even paying them properly to be able to do that. And interestingly, we're making it very hard for those people to self-isolate if they need to, because they don't have the wages or the savings to be able to do so. And in many cases, they wouldn't be paid for that period of isolation. But I think that there is a broader point, which you alluded to as well, Celia, and that's about industrial strategy. So we have chosen in this country, or sleepwalked into a situation where our whole social care model is based on debt financing, on low pay, of high turnover and insecure work. It doesn't have to be like that. In Germany, the majority of people who work in the care sector are trained up to the level of a district nurse. We have nothing like that in the United Kingdom. So the business model, and they are businesses because they're not part of our National Health Service, they're run almost entirely by private providers, are based on this model of low pay and high turnover. And if we want a social care sector that is different, then I think that will involve some sort of greater integration with our National Health Service. One of the recommendations as well that I made in my Everyday Economy pamphlet, which I hope that we in the Labour Party under Keir's leadership will look at more, would be to create some sort of Royal College of Care, in the same way that you have a Royal College of GPs or midwives, to improve the status and the voice of people who work in that sector. At the moment, there's almost no way for people who work in social care to come together, and we saw that during the crisis. The voice of people who worked in social care was so diffused that it made it harder for them to speak with one voice, and I think that needs to change as well.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, we've got a fair number of questions about devolution, localism, which you've touched on already, and I think I could come to Kevin to, if you put your video on, Kevin, to actually ask a question about devolution from a Welsh point of view, I think.
Well, I don't want to be typecast as just a Welsh point of view, but Rachel, many thanks for that. Rachel, now that the Tories have stolen Labour's traditional clothes in the sense of higher public spending and a levelling up rhetoric and so on and so forth, how does Labour now go about really differentiating itself in the political marketplace? I think many people here today would say that it should be through a more compelling combination of radical devolution, a Green New Deal, and the foundational economy. I think you think that, but to what extent is that agenda really supported in the shadow cabinet today? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question, Kevin. When Keir offered me this job in the shadow cabinet, so it's a funny job I've got. So my title is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and I'm responsible for Labour's Brexit policy. I'm responsible for for outsourcing, our strategy and policies and response on outsourcing. But most importantly, and what attracted me to the role, was that Keir asked me to sort of take a step back role and help develop ideas for the future. And that's really sort of on two levels. First of all, any party that has lost 4 general elections in a row needs to do a pretty serious rethink, and also needs to have a bit of humility you know, if we had all the answers, then we wouldn't be in this place where we've been out of power for 10 years. Yeah, so part of it is that, but the other part is we've just gone through, and we're still going through, this terrible pandemic, which has revealed, I think, quite a lot about the country that we live in, and as I've referred to it, our lack of resilience as a nation, as communities, and at an individual or family level. So I'm working with Carol and others in trying to understand how Labour can offer a radical and a compelling vision to the country at the next election, most likely in 2024. And all of those things that you spoke about there, Kevin, on radical devolution, about the foundational and about the Green New Deal, you know, they absolutely need to be part of our offer at the next election. On the Green New Deal, we also need to link it more to the foundational and the things that matter in people's lives. So, you know, certainly the Green New Deal can deliver jobs with meaning and value that are better paid in all parts of the country, but also a Green New Deal and more emphasis on green and clean places to live is also about the places that we live and whether we feel pride in them and whether they are attractive places to live. So we see, for example, a huge demographic move of young people from towns to cities. What can we do to make our former industrial towns and our seaside towns places that have jobs, but are also places that people want to and choose to live in, rather than, sadly, in too many cases, places that people are desperate to get out of if they can. And so I think all of those things are going to be part of our offer. We're not in the place at the moment to set out a manifesto for the next election. It'd be wrong to do that. I think that Labour have got a lot to learn from listening, and that's why, you know, really over the last 5 years, and also in this role, I'm going to make sure that I carry on reading, listening, talking to people, because no one in the Labour Party or on the Labour Party front bench has a monopoly on good ideas. We'll get those from listening to people who have left us, but also listening to people in academia, in policy spheres, who think a lot about these things. And a lot of the work I've done over the last 2 years, you know, frankly, I wouldn't have been able to do at the speed and the pace that I've done if it wasn't for conversations that I've had with Carol and others about the foundation and the everyday and how we can use that to better connect. So those things that you spoke about, you know, very high up on my agenda. I want to develop them, make sure that they work, and also, you know, to hold the government to account. They made big promises to people at the last election on getting Brexit done, and that's a total mess, and on levelling up, and we've seen none of that. Indeed, the places that have been most affected by coronavirus are those places that, in many cases, are the left behind communities, and 10 years of Tory austerity has left them incredibly ill prepared and not resilient to what they've had to face over the last few months.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Now, I know you have to go to your next meeting at 11 o'clock. It's 5 to 11 now. I think you need a small space in which to chill and gear up for the next meeting. Should we at this point thank you for the presentation, for answering the questions so cogently, and say broadly that it's encouraging that somebody who's open to new ideas should be so well placed in the Labour Party. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you, Carol. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Now we're going to move on now to Fabrizio. If Fabrizio unmutes his mic and puts the video on. And my apologies, incidentally, to all attendees who asked questions. I know there were half a dozen good questions still waiting, but time is short. And hopefully with Fabrizio, we have slightly more time for Q&A without the pressure of Fabrizio needing to leave for another meeting. So Fabrizio, a European perspective, because one of the interesting things about foundational thinking, of course, is that it it's very grounded. I mean, in the UK, it's most influential in Wales, but also the largest group of academics who are interested in foundational thinking is actually in Italy. And we try to be European and, well, if not cosmopolitan, because that's faintly a term of abuse, isn't it? But Fabrizio, in many ways, you're doing overlapping work with the DD group. So give us your thoughts really on the possibility, which is what you're raising in your last manifesto, of a radical turn after COVID-19. And also in that manifesto, I thought there was the idea that if we didn't take a radical turn, the future was going to be very unpleasant indeed. So maybe you could talk a bit about dystopia as well as the possibility of a radical turn. Fabrizio, over to you.
Sure, Carol, and great to be with you. And again, as our sort of routes have crisscrossed in the last few years in a very substantial way. Yes, there is a chance, but it is very hard to catch it. This is, if I had only 10 seconds, it would be my summing up. I will follow on, Rachel, the noticing and stressing how amazingly similar are the troubles that COVID has brought to the fore. Almost every single word of that description of what is happening and what could alternatively happen, I could repeat for my country, for a couple of other countries that I know about. Let's assume then with Rachel that we do know, I'll come back to it, what the alternative is. Let's assume for a second that we do agree on that. Let me I'll be able to articulate what the Forum is doing and how difficult it is to push it through the political spectrum by mentioning to you the three requisites that need to be satisfied for a true U-turn to take place. Very simple. And I stay on those scheme. First of all, enough people need to be convinced that an alternative truly exists. That is not just a game of utopia versus dystopia. And for that to happen, people need to believe that the injustice of today is not unavoidable. Okay? Second, we need to have a vision of such an alternative and a strategy to get there. Strategy to get there, not just a vision to jump to it, but a strategy to get there. And third, we need to be convincing. I need to appeal to the sentiments, to the moral sentiments of the people. People are upset. People are striving for something else, but they're not necessarily at all convinced that they can actually spend some of their time helping moving in a direction towards a vision. So we need to be convincing. And we need to have enough social and political mobilization to fight for it, to beat the defenders of the status quo, okay? Those that just want to go back. I don't particularly like the word resilience. We don't want to go back to what we were before COVID. We need transformation, we need change. We don't want to consider what it was before a normality. Now, why are these three requisites hard to satisfy? Because the neoliberal thinking has penetrated into the left or center left, call it the way you want, so deeply that it has distorted the way to go about, and it has created a political vacuum. Let's start with that, which enormous amount of people not voting and not being engaged and not believing that the change can happen because we told them that there was no alternative. And that this political vacuum has more recently been filled, and I come to the point, by populist movement, fine, but by also networks and alliances of civil society organization, or as my friend Giovanni Moro calls them more appropriately, active citizen organization. These organizations have always been convinced throughout these 40 years of neoliberalism that there was an alternative. And the reason why they were convinced is that they have pursued it place by place to try to produce alternatives, okay? But, what is the but? The action of these organizations have been inadequate. They have either been micro local strategies addressing in your own language, with your own ideas and values in mind, but at a very local level, and failing to produce any systemic effect. This is what your academics, Nick Mnichek and Alex William, have called folk politics, a deep suspicion for abstraction, for conceptual frameworks and mediation and compromises, ignoring long-term and rejecting the project of hegemony, i.e. becoming culturally hegemonic in order to convince, and third, often preferring to be voluntaristic at the local level action and rather than institutional, putting institutions aside. We just don't like them. This is where the chances are today, and this is where the Forum on Inequality and Diversity came about. It is an alliance of 8 organizations of very different culture: liberal, Catholic and social Christian, and socialist and communist. I say communist because some come from that tradition of the Italian Communist Party, which wasn't the same of other communism. Okay, so these different organizations, Caritas Italiana, Action Aid, Cittadinanza Attiva, the Environmental League, Lega Ambiente, they came together with 100 researchers from university, who never stopped, neither the organizations nor the academics, to believe that there was an alternative, but they suddenly came together. They came together with the target of producing a conceptual framework, of bringing together their vocabulary, there is an issue of vocabulary, and presenting very concrete proposals. They worked on the 3 levels I mentioned before, that's why I mentioned them. They came together and tried to capture some kind of understanding that the depth of inequalities, not only economic and social, but also recognition inequalities, some of what Rachel mentioned are recognition, as the German philosophers called them, the idea that your role in society, your value are not recognized, which is as important as economic and social inequalities, that the depth of inequalities is actually not the result of globalization, of technological progress, or even of not a result of social fragmentation in itself, but it is the result of mistakes or wrong policies done on purpose. The conviction that there is an alternative around the thinking of Tony Atkinson, that you know very well about, and his amazing last book of his life. Plus, when COVID has come, when COVID-19 has come, as exactly as Rachel has stressed it, this has unleashed what, as an economist, I call changes in preferences, which partly Rachel described. I add to what Rachel said, not only more understanding of what really matters. Marx would have said of use values rather than exchange values, but also understanding of how much care matters, how much living in a community where people can exchange and help each other matters, how much producing energy at local level rather than depending on long-term transmission matters, how much food, as we say in Italy, chilometro zero, 0 kilometer proximity food matters, and so far and so on. This change in preferences is extremely important for all of us, because it's happening at the individual level and is putting onto the market a new demand that can be satisfied either by social enterprises or by private enterprises or even by good public administration. So that's a very important point. First, so there is the awareness that change could actually happen as a result, not just of some people theorizing, but of people change of preferences. Second, a vision and a strategy. We converge as 8 organizations on a very simple idea of Amartya Sen, of defining social and environmental justice as substantial freedom, the actual freedom of everybody to pursue the life that it is in her or his capacity and potential to live. And this change of emphasis from equality suddenly gives equality a different taste, is the chance to be different, not the need to be identical, okay? And also in terms of vision, what we converged, what we 8 organizations and 100 researchers converge, where I see convergence, Carol, around Europe, is the need for pre-distributive policies, not just redistributive policies. We cannot stress redistribution. We need to intervene in the process of formation of capital, both at industrial level, entrepreneurial level, and the way infrastructures come about. And these, in turn, another convergence of our forum, it requires a drastic change and a rebalancing of power. As Rachel said, we need to have labor back into the game of mattering as a stakeholders, which was off during the 30 years of neoliberalism. We need a rebalancing of power from to women, particularly relevant in my country, which is still a few decades behind in this area. And we need a rebalancing of power, still again particularly relevant in my country, but also everywhere, to youth. Not because there is an opposition between the interests of young people and old people, as neoliberals keep saying, but because only if the young people are actually given a chance, independently of their parents' wealth, to play a role in this society, then there can be change. And finally, in terms of strategy, a matter of access to knowledge. The enormous concentration of knowledge and power is the result of choices, not just of technologies, the result of the TRIPS agreement of 1994, which has unbalanced the equilibrium between the principle of protecting intellectual property rights and at the same time protecting the fundamental principle of knowledge as the most important common good. So we do need to address the issue of making sure that people, small enterprises, everybody can access to knowledge. And from this point of view, COVID-19 has moved exactly in the opposite direction by accelerating the process of concentration of knowledge. So this is a very fundamental issue. And finally, on vision and strategy, an issue fundamental for the forum is what Rachel has touched upon, and that is again an issue of convergence, Carol, which is giving all of us some hope, which is the attention to places. One size does not fit all. So social infrastructure, interventions in territories cannot come about neither as a result of decisions taken in the capitals, nor as a good old-fashioned local development policies where municipalities are left on their own, because that will result in the nepotism, into the old interest, into the rentier probably capturing the use of the funds. But we need a combination of the two. Very strong national guidelines, very precise guidelines, and the empowerment of the local level under one constraint, that decisions have to be taken through a very participatory process, what my friend Chuck Sable called democratic experimentalism. These are the ideas of the forum. These we converge. And I tell you, because you're asking us about also method, we took a year and a half in closed doors to decide that we do believe that. And we built a wiki forum. You can have a taste of it. I'll put some stuff in English on the chat, so you'll be able to make the links. We built 64 words on which we decided to agree, and only after we agreed with them, we moved on. Finally, I mentioned before the conviction, the capacity to spread, to convince, which requires, first of all, remembering what we knew 40 years ago, that conflict is a good thing. None of what we are saying, none of what Rachel is saying will come without conflict. Why? Because there are enormous interests that want to keep the things they are. And today, you ask me, Utopia, we have two alternative scenarios to the one that we share. We have a scenario of authoritarianism, what a fantastic book of Karen Sennett foresaw in 2005, whereby people anger, people resentment is captured by somebody that says, I will decide for you. And you do have a taste of that in your country. And the Anglo-Saxon people have a very strong taste of that in the US. And we do have a taste of that everywhere. And we do have political forces in my country that push into this direction. And people who do not really believe in alternative things, that at least I have somebody deciding and then creating walls. So this is a very strong, it's still there. Let's not forget about it. And then we have the neoliberal that's still alive wherever and around us. And they asking, we called it in the forum, we called the normality and progress, technology acceleration, smart working, moving ahead with the digital economy, digitalizing urban areas. Okay, we saw a lot of that with no clarifications. We know people are not there. Persons are not at the center of this reasoning. It's just that we entrust those who we have already entrusted with power to carry on the design. After COVID, we need to hurry. So there has to be conflict. There will be conflict. With no conflict, will not come to any change. And then finally, on my scheme, and then I leave the last 5 minutes to say, you know, have we moved? Have we gone anywhere since we started? The role of moral sentiments. We do need, and here my quotation, very important quotation, is Jonathan Haidt, together with Karen Sennert, the people like you believing in fundamental economy, believing in an alternative, believing in a U-turn need to appeal to the people, not just with the vision, which is complex, because our vision is always more complex than the other two visions of the other two dystopia that I described, but we need to appeal to some moral, simple words, authority. We need to provide an authority. We need to make people feeling that they can rely on us. We're not just those people discussing and debating and being complex and participatory. Participatory process will come to an end and we'll take decisions. We need loyalty, a very important concept in capitalism and in neoliberalism, very important for the authoritarian dynamic. We need to believe in communities. We are cosmopolitan, but as Kwame Appiah says, the African philosophers, we are partial cosmopolitans, because we do believe that there is a plus within communities. And finally, sanctity. We do need to appeal to a few words in collective interest, brother and sister. Everybody is a brother and a sister. These are simple concepts, but sorry to say, but we are inheriting these from the different culture that I'm making the forum. The last 5 minutes, as I said, how we move forward. Did we have any impact? We produce a lot. We produce strategies, vocabularies, words, seminars, and then 15 proposals to do what I said. I might answer to some of these questions, coherent with what I just said. Very operational. 3 at European level, some at national level, concerning labor power, concerning all areas. And then when COVID came, we fought for emergency income, because the leading class of my country, and this partly answering already, including the PD, were not particularly keen in paying attention to 6.5 million of people who are either irregular or short-term workers who suddenly did not have any backing. And the unions were not particularly keen in backing these people, from which the awareness of a possible need of universal income, but in the meantime, take care of them. So we fought for this battle. So we abandoned for a second the strategies, the long term, and we said we need to act. So, and we did it. We did it helped by the bishops, yes, by the bishops of this country that put pressure on government. How far are we gone in 5 directions? First of all, we moved to contaminate our own organizations. Remember that when you are a coalition of organizations, you have your members, but you're working with a leading group of the members and not necessarily with the members. So we're still working very hard to make sure that our ideas percolate within Caritas, within the civic organization, within the people working for environment. The social media, the classical old battles. I just give you a few numbers that you judge, and you can see our blog and judge how you like it. We moved ahead. In 2018, we had 35 people connecting to our website, and now we are at 84,000. During the lockdown, we had an enormous amount of webinars. Say, okay, everybody, it's good to do it. Maybe 2 people attending. No. It was a jump for us because we were there. We had very strong words. We had 53 meetings during the 100 days of crazy lockdown of this country. And we moved ahead a lot in those days. So we did what we could. What impact on parties? You might be interested to know. Well, not much. Not much. Not much. They are entangled in short-term and responsibility. They're still not switched to representing, to listening, to understanding where people are really moving to direction. And we had some effects, but we had some effects on individual members of this party, sometimes in government, a couple of ministers with which we have a strong linkage and communications, many MPs. Just the Democratic Party? Not at all. One of the so-called populist party, the Five Star movements, has many interesting people, young people, women and men, particularly women, who did not find previously in the PD the room to move ahead in politics. And some of them are lost, but some of them are very keen to learn and to know and to have tools. So we do have very strong linkages with small groups of MPs of many different parties, and we do have a dialogue, even with young members of right-wing parties, which is what we should do to convince everybody. And finally, at the European level, I just, apart from opportunities like this one that we are giving to us to communicate to you, and I'm just about to put on the web the linkages, there is something going on within the Social Democrat family at European level. Is there? Yes, there is. Between the foundation, the Progressive Foundation, the FEPS, there was not later than a week ago a debate attended by leaders of the different parties, MPs from European Parliament, and I can tell you, I can elaborate on that more if you want, that I was positively surprised. Andres Rodriguez Pose and me were in a common session discussing abandoning areas, place-based policies, the need to use the recovery and resilience facility, not in a top-down, good old-fashioned, rentier-oriented way. And we felt that there was more convergence, still not enough, Carol, Kevin, and all friends. So I'm ready to answer to questions. The real issue is social mobilization. How can it come about with parties being so careful and at best careful to move ahead in the direction that you envisage?
Let me unmute and start the video. Right, that brings me back. That's great, Fabrizio. A spirited presentation ending with the problem of political mobilization. And I think at this point now, I've been changing the procedure as we go along, but we'd originally intended to take a 5-minute break, Fabrizio, for people to type questions into the Q&A box. I now want to offer people a 3 or 4 minute break so that they can think a little about what you've said, and I will have then a bank of questions to throw at you. And we're now on 11:18 or thereabouts. We'll run forward towards 12 noon because I'm sure there are lots of questions there. So we're now going to have a 4-minute break, and type your questions into the Q&A box, please, so that we can ask them of Fabrizio.
Now I have Q&A session.
Right. Hi all, we're back now, and Fabrizio is muted, but he's going to unmute his mic so that he can answer your questions. And the placeholder in the intermission was, of course, for the Foundational Economy and Citizenship book, whose themes overlap with what Fabrizio was talking about. And of course, everybody is shifting product in our world. You'll have noticed that the placeholder had a discount code on it, which entitles you to 30% off. So we're not entirely unworldly, and we've got lots of questions. And a first one, you were talking very much, Fabrizio, about your present engagement with the DD group and all the rest of it. But the first one comes from Laurie Tanich, who remembers, of course, the classic report for the EU on territorial cohesion, remembers you were a minister for territorial cohesion. And Laurie's question was, how is territorial cohesion affected by COVID-19? Differences between urban and rural areas, deindustrialized and prosperous areas. How does this play into the post-COVID-19 situation?
Thank you for the opportunity to cover this point. On the one hand, as it has happened in previous modern, not ancient pandemic, according to papers, the pandemic, the crisis is running through the faulty lines of the previous situation. So you do have some obvious negative effects. People in peripheries, particularly overcrowded buildings, suffered more. Italy has a degree of overcrowding higher than similar industrialized countries in Europe, and people suffered. Women suffered a lot in terms of suddenly having to put up all day with terrible men, and people living in social housing, devastated social housing, where there is no exchange, no reciprocity, suffered a lot. So peripheries suffered. And then also rural areas happen not to be even covered by digitalization. So you do run this lovely school teaching on the web, and the kids cannot even attend, forget about the quality of the teaching. So you do have these and many others potential widening of the crisis. But there is something more sophisticated happening. And I mentioned two examples. Within cities, for example, the possibly permanent shift of people working with numbers now tell us in Italy that only about 70-75% might come back to work in the big infrastructure buildings where they used to work, both in private and public sector. So we do have a reduction of people moving from peripheries to the centers of town or to office areas, and this shifts the demand for simple things like my glasses, the kind of things that you do within your area of living, and it's offering peripheries an opportunity. Rural areas that potentially where I've been spending a lot of my life, and where I tried as a minister to enact what I had with the help of Andres and Philip McCann and many others design at the time in inner areas of my country. These rural areas were already before the crisis having some potential advantages from climate change. I mean, remember, I'm talking about Italy, but I'm also talking about Austria, some areas of France, where the rural areas are close to towns, and there is sudden uncomfortable living in these towns because of climate change, because of heat waves, and this moving of bourgeoisie towards the inner areas, and people moving because they can work there. Now, the COVID has accelerated, when I mention change of preferences, a demand for short-term tourism, for visiting your areas, appreciating and spending some lovely time with friends and family in the inner areas close to the town. So this is again offering opportunities which immediately some Archie star, have captured in my country. We always jump from nothing to sort of leading articles on newspapers, then nothing happens, of course, but it's still signaling that there is this awareness of a new opportunity. So this is This is an interesting shift, and that, if I still have another minute to these very important questions, is opening a very important chance for people who believe in place-based approach. What we try to, when in 2008 we launched the place-based approach, we were strongly contrasted by the World Bank, actively so. Let's remember the culture. I don't need to tell you, Karen and Kevin, and Ian, that culture is a battleground. We were strongly opposing Brussels, with the World Bank was active in organizing seminars against this idea. It wasn't just a matter of convincing. Today, now, the idea that one size does not fit all, that we do need to listen to people, if nothing else, because otherwise they're too upset, or more interestingly, because they might have a knowledge to share in designing a school, in designing a social infrastructure, in understanding how care should be implemented. Last example, in Italy, people realized how much worse in terms of health response regions like Lombardy have responded, where the polarization in big hospitals, in big towns had taken place at a hurried pace, compared to places where the linkages between health and welfare, localized welfare, based on, relying on individual territorial doctors had still been maintained and improved. So a big chance in terms of abandoned territories, but again, it needs to be captured by authorities, and the Recovery and Resilience Fund is the next 2 months battleground, at least for countries that have the chance to stay within the European Union, but culture has no boundary, fortunately, is the big chance of how this money will be spent, seconding these opportunities or rather crushing them.
Right. Thank you, Fabrizio. Here's another question. They're coming in thick and fast. And this question is about national income accounting and the way in which at present, and this question comes from Emir, who says, one of the fundamental ways of measuring current economic success is GDP. We all need to take a broader view of economic and social improvement, but Emir's question is, what metrics can be used to measure success, and how do you persuade policymakers and parties to move away from trading GDP figures, which, as we know, they are doing throughout the COVID crisis, where they're thinking about, is it 5% or 7% or 10% decline in GDP?
Absolutely. A caveat, and then I agree, a very short question. Caveat is that GDP is still measuring something that we should not forget. So I completely agree with your request, but we are in capitalism. Income and people chance to buy whatever they want come under the form of money. Money is one of the dimensions of well-being. It's not to be taken away. And through GDP, we measure the enormous concentration of wealth and income that is taking place while we're speaking now, with increased inequality. Having said that, I completely agree with you. How do we do it? You know better than I. How do I see the chances? Well, of course, the 17 sustainable goals are sort of kind of getting into under the skin of authorities, but still think about the promise of the President of the European Commission to move the European semester, i.e. the most important coordinating tool of budgetary national policies, in the direction not just of stability, meaning and growth, but also of other measures. Is happening? No, it is not first in the agenda. It's a promise. Is it happening in every country? In some. So very slow moving into this direction. But when it comes to the game, it's just GDP growth. The one practical way, which I've always pursued, and I think we have a chance to pursue, since we're talking about practical things, is the outcome indicators that we use in policymaking. There we have a chance, whenever there is a policy, a new infrastructure, a bridge, a new hospital, a redesign of the system of the distribution, to pin them down, the vision, the promise of the politicians, into 2 or 3 outcome indicators. Don't take me wrong. I don't believe in 2 or 3 outcome indicators, because then it's up to people to judge. But at least that changes the metric, And it does so not in a jump way. Having said that, I would also keep an eye on the people who are working today in this new way of measuring GDP, also bringing redistribution and distributive perspective into the GDP. So a lot is happening at academic level. You know better than I. It used to be my work, is not anymore. But I don't see it biting into politics and policymaking yet. And again, big expenses, big investment in infrastructure. If we call for this new metric to be used, at least when they announce the results, that's a little dent.
Right. A kind of related question from Betty Baraki, Fabrizio. She wants you to talk a bit more about universal basic services or universal basic income. And her question is, which one is better and how do we get there? And I'd add a second, a supplementary really. Aren't both UBS and UBI tied up with a kind of sectarianism of the opposition to neoliberalism? Do you understand? They spend a lot of time hitting each other over the head rather than focusing on the enemy, so to speak. So which one is better? How do we get there? And isn't the opposition between the two part of our current political problem?
Yes, it is. I take your hint. I do believe that with my friend Elena Granaglia, who is member of the forum, who works on these issues, I do believe with her that the issue is a combination of the two, which probably must be shaped to the different nature of territories and countries, and also both their traditions. Having said that, you can never renounce to a universal basic service. You know why very well, because if the rich and the wealthy don't put pressure on the quality of services in normal societies, we are not getting there. So we need them to be part of the game. We do believe that very strongly, but I don't see any opposition in being complementing that with some experimental example of universal basic income. Why? For a very simple reason, because otherwise we'll be pushed into thinking that work and jobs is the only way. Now, I do come from the socialist traditions. Yes, I do. I do think that labor and working has something in itself, but we should not kind of in a negotiating way, not any job. And we would have much less bad jobs and much more good jobs if the alternative to a good job was not a bad job, but was to getting something anyway. So I think we should move together against this, the people who do attack both. And of course, when you're suddenly faced with the disasters of the neoliberal reforms of labor market in Italy, number I told you before, 6.5 million of people that are either irregular, 3.5 or 3 million, very short term, 2 months, a week, recurrent work only a month a year. When you're faced with that, you do realize that there is one argument more in favor of experimenting income. Just to mention, I would be unfair to the forum if I didn't mention that I will put on the table another kind of proposals that we do put ahead, which is a universal inheritance. That's Tony Atkinson's idea. It does not play in the same ground. It has to do with observing that for a girl of 18 years old, two identical girls with identical capacity, having identical chances, but living in two different families, one can actually do the fantastic year abroad. One can actually start a startup. One can actually go to whatever university, the other one can't, because he has to throw away her knowledge into doing something because she needs to earn. Then one way out is a wealth for everybody, the inheritance for everybody. We propose a 15,000 euros inheritance at the age of 18, which becomes from adolescence, from the age of 14, part of a national debate to equalize people, to make people aware on how to use it. So as my friend Marco Rossidoria puts it, that would also turn the age of 18, it would repristinate, recreate some kind of totem in an age of 18 that is often sort of disappeared as a symbol. Just to say that it's good when we put all our cards on the table, and particularly when we don't shut our ears to other people's ideas if they make some sense. The forum will be working on universal basic income, doing simulations, just so you know that when we speak, we are practical. So we'll have results of an empirical research applied to Italy by the end of 2021.
Right. Can I come back, Fabrizio, and ask you to expand something which you were talking about, which was interesting to me, and abuse my position as chair. We all recognize that change depends on political alliances of one sort or another. Clearly, this is the reality of politics as it now is in every European country, and of civil society organization. Now, you briefly mentioned the DD bringing together the liberal, the Catholic, the socialist, the communist. And you briefly mentioned the 64 words, and then the shift towards policy. And I wanted you to talk a bit about the possibilities and the difficulties of these processes, and maybe to think a bit about your own position in it, because it wouldn't be, I think, indiscreet to say that you are a good socialist who is the son of a communist family in some ways. You know, many of us come ourselves from mixed political backgrounds. So talk a bit more, Fabrizio, about the difficulties and the possibilities of this kind of alliance that you've put together with the DD.
I do with pleasure, Carol, because what I discovered in this third, whatever it is, phase of my life is how important it is to put yourself a repentaglio, we say in Italian, at risk, if you want, to put some of your belief at some risk. And Carol, the point is that you do it with people you trust. You don't want to do it with people you don't. So if I can put it in a word, and then I'll answer pointedly to your question, what happened in this amazing enterprise of the forum is that we first smelled each other, and then we decided that we could put each other at risk, sort of risking. And where did I risk, for example? I risked, and that allowed me to understand the potential of one line of our Italian constitution, what Piero Zanvalon calls the constitutional people, which is important, because if there is a chance to interpret the constitution in a way that suits our ideas, is useful. And that was the word person. I'd always had a trouble with individual and person, let's face it. Then I was escaping it by saying, individual and person. So individual is bad, person is good, but that wasn't really tackling it. Working with Caritas Italiana, I'd be very frank, on one hand, that has a certain idea of brotherhood and sisterhood, Franciscan and Jesuit. I'm not mentioning these two sources by chance, since they are two cultural sources of the current Pope. Working with them, and at the same time working with Action Aid, which is our liberal side, okay? And observing these two organizations finding a bit difficult to cope with each other at the beginning, because they were really at two different sides. Sometimes Action Aid can come out with the expression, the market share of the cooperative market, meaning the number of poor people in the world that we're covering. So even small languages can act, and then you suddenly become suspicious. But seeing them working on individual and person allowed me to understand better that the two, on the moral side, on the moral sentiments, that the combination of collective interest, which still is my belief as an ex-socialist, but as you know, has done terrible damage when we identify this collective interest in the state, or we suppress the individual interest in the name of a collective interest, okay? We know what we're talking about. Then if you do combine these with the Senian, for me, Senian, for a Franciscan or a Catholic, is is everybody I have in front of me is my brother and my sister, which is not, is like myself, is stronger than that. Then putting this collective interest and everybody is my brother and my sister, sorry to go to such basic things, but that's what you end up discussing when you go to the roots. That suddenly made me understanding the beautiful words of our Italian constitution say, the Republic is the duty of the Republic. The Republic is not the state, is all of us. The duty of the Republic to remove the obstacles to the full development of every person. This is what they wrote. They wrote, who? Our ancestors who had fought fascism as Catholic, as Christian, as Protestants, as Valdese, they were very active in Piedmont, as socialists and communists. Now, and they wrote this expression, and we have discredited it. We have not used it, so we came back to use it. So this is an example, Carol, of how difficult it was in some moments. And so we play the same game with many other words. Poverty, we explore poverty, we explore poverty and inequality. I give a small example and then shut up. What I asked my friend in Caritas, why are you wasting your time with us? Because these are big organizations. They do good things for small people, for Maria or Ramirez, whoever they're called. Why are you spending time? And she said, because we realize that we need to move from poverty to inequality, because if we don't address inequality at its roots, that's Papa Francesco when he said that we need to address the issue of formation of capital. That's what he wrote. But then Caritas is now strongly believing that we should not just address people when they become poor, but before they become poor. So these are the kinds of the risky business that we did together, achieving a certain degree. And let me tell you one last thing. We have an example in Italy of a similar attempt. When Romano Prodi, somebody you know who's been president of the commission, was also together with a couple of other people, invented the Democratic Party, and invented it exactly as a new party that would overcome those old barriers. I don't call them ideological because I don't mind ideologies, but close ideologies we don't like. The whole idea of the Democratic Party of Italy was a combination of them. What went wrong culturally? They did not do what Rachel today said, that she wants to read a lot and have a lot of communication with people like you. There was not much cultural discussion. They thought they would jump, and this was the bad influence on neoliberalism. They would jump to technical decisions. That the issue was, and if you try to jump to technical decisions without having come to terms with some basic conceptual terms, then you know better than I that you don't get anywhere.
I understand that. Can I again abuse my position to ask a supplementary? I understand entirely that what you describe is an exercise in finding terms of agreement, we might call it in English, between the different factions of social thinking. But then, and that experiment seems to be, in your view, very successful, or at least, dialogue is possible. But the real problem then, as you explained it both in the presentation and in your last answer, is the problem of the politicians who are not in the Rachel Reeves listening mode. Do you understand? I mean, Rachel is being criticized everywhere for not coming up with policies immediately. And she keeps on saying, I'm listening, I'll organize another seminar, and people want to hit her over the head for that. What do we do about the world of, in a sense, it's technocracy, but it's also the short term of politics, the immediate requirements, the electoral cycle, the 24-hour news cycle, etc. What do we do when you found the terms of agreement in the DD, Fabrizio? What do you do about the bloody politicians?
Well, first you make sure that's not irrelevant, that is not just the 15 of you that share it. And you make sure that if Caritas has 3 representatives, that you want to speak to the organization. That's not irrelevant, because in the end, the members or for different regional structure of those organizations, they will interact with the local politicians. I'll come back to the local politicians, okay? So first you want to be sure, though we try to make sure, we haven't made sure, but we work very hard not to look as if there was a a leading group of this organization talking to the academics, funding the squaring the circle, and then keeping it for themselves. So we have worked very hard. We're still not there, but we are working hard on that. Then we, in the interaction with the party, particularly the two parties, let's be practical, otherwise I'll stay on theory. On the Democratic Party, there has been dialogue with the lead of the party, which led to an event, Carol, which I must mention now that you asked this question directly, i.e. a very open-minded, extraordinarily culturally minded person of the Democratic Party, close to the current secretary, decided to organize in Bologna a major meeting, not a minor meeting, of the party as a whole, to invite Mr. Barca, not as Mr. Barca, but as the coordinator of the forum, to speak. And I was supposed to do a 35-minute speech, and I'm terribly sorry to say that I spoke for 60 minutes because of the audience. I had about 400 people in the room, and many others listening. And I didn't say we know what to do. I discussed about methodology, and then I was carried on by the attention. Okay, and there was a big applause at the end. I mention it because I'm over that kind of things, but because it was almost embarrassing. It wasn't applause to me, as it has written in a book by a leader of the PD party. It was an applause to the party coming back to discussion, to conceptual framework, to words, to meanings, okay? Very good news, fantastic. But then the party sort of shrink back with the kind of thing, yes, but we have to go back to the town. What do we say to the small and medium-sized enterprises? But we just talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, the opportunities that they can get at local level. So difficult. It opening, shutting. There was some more opening during the COVID, then shutting. But this opening and shutting is producing some results at local level, because we do have an enormous amount of territorial units. I mean, remember the Democratic Party of Italy still got about 4,000 and a half. Territorial units. There are still 400,000, but possibly very active 120,000, 150,000 members. And they do call for meetings, for discussion, for contribution, and they do put some pressures within the party. Will it change it? I'm just describing what's happening. In the case of the 5-star movement, unfortunately, the 5-star movement, when too quickly, too rapidly came to power, dismantled what was the most interesting part of that party, which was the meetup, in English, of course, because we need to use English words. Meetup, this kind of system of territorial discussions that they carried by offering a new platform to people, by saying, if you come to this platform, you'll matter, and you choose your own candidates. Then the candidates were elected, but they dismantled the meetup. But some of the MPs of the M5-star movement still have the meetup in their lungs. And so they are very keen and careful to listen, to use the material. I found some of our stuff being used in parliamentary discussion, but this in a very scatterly way, because the M5-star movement is not any longer sort of. So this is the impact. I should mention a last thing important. We do have a strong alliances with local administrators. For example, our last paper, 24th of July paper on how to use the Recovery and Resilience Facility, was co-signed by the Polytechnic of Milan, academia, and by us very important people. In one case, a mayor; in other case, assessori, how do you call them? Members of the board of the town of Milan, Rome, Naples, and Palermo, and Carol, a small group of small municipalities in inner areas. So we do have much better dialogue with some of the members of the PD working at local level who do know more than what we talk about than some national ones.
Right. Now I'm going to come back to Kevin to ask the last question, because we're slowly coming up against our 12 noon deadline. Kevin, can you unmute your mic and switch on the vision and ask Fabrizio a last question?
Fabrizio, thanks for that truly excellent presentation and contributions. I'm left thinking, reflecting on your experience, who are the agents of change, and what are the scales of change in your mind now? You know, The famous influential Barker report, which you remember well because you wrote it, said that the answer was a combination of place-based local action in concert with extra local action informed by the concept of Chuck Sable's democratic experimentalism. Do you still agree with that basic conception? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Kevin, remembering very interesting moment with you in your country, in your area. Yes, I do, but I do definitely, because I've seen it happening through action. Our strategy for inner areas, for people who are listening who don't know what it is, it's a strategy that involves today 1,050 municipalities all over the country that we promoted alliances. So they are now allied in 72 area projects where we are trying to experiment that kind of place-based approach. Everything is going well, not at all, because the central public administrations have often blocked it because political national leaders have not worked with it. But that kind of experience, as well as an experience with metropolitan areas, proves that it can happen. And that if the agents of change are local level, so I'm still exploring the yes, then I will say the additional point, that the local agents of change end up being in a country like Italy, the mayors, some extraordinary teachers, so school leaders, some extraordinary few cases of civic society. I'm going in a degree of a lesser role, entrepreneurial, not so much, labor and organized labor, unfortunately, not so much. Very conservative from this point of view, although now we are making some breakthrough. But compared to that kind of thinking, I come to believe that we do need at national level, a EU-wide level, some lever that can actually be appealing to the European and nationwide class. And I come to believe, starting with the idea with the problem of knowledge, i.e., starting with the idea that a large part of the inequality that we suffer depends on a bad use of technological transformation and concentration of knowledge, that we do need some big action. Let's call it industrial policy. Suddenly now everybody can use again these two words. I didn't use them at the time. I don't tend to use them now. I'll be more specific. The issue of knowledge cannot be dealt with just by. The turning point in technology is so enormous that it cannot just be dealt by reducing the power of big corporations through regulatory agencies, tax or competition laws. We have seen it. We do need, and I've come to believe, and the forum proposes that we need to rely on two very important agencies that do already exist. Universities. We're working a lot with the idea that universities can play a more important social role, becoming more aware of the extraordinary difference that they can make in transferring knowledge to the big guys or transferring knowledge to the small guys. Sorry if I'm so simplistic, but I know I have a very few minutes. And even more so, state-owned enterprises. This is a step ahead that we made in the last 2 years. State-owned enterprises. At every turn of capitalism, it happened when, at the time of the India, it came again when railways came along. For a country like Italy, it was fundamental after the war. We do need to rely on in three areas: digital transformation, because we need the platforms that are not run by corporations. In the area of energy transition, particularly green hydrogen, and in the area of health and aging, we might be helped by a new role of state-owned enterprises, possibly EU-wide one. Massimo Florio is putting on the floor, possibly in the European Parliament. He put on the floor a few days. There are a couple of papers I can send you on the chance that we have to build, to start from the 1,000 public research center of Europe that do produce an enormous high quality open science that end up being absorbed, used only by private corporations that sell it to us. making us pay twice. We paid it as taxpayer, then we pay it again at the monopoly prices, and also we put free information on the web. So we pay 3 times some of these products. Well, we need to contrast that with some risky, yes, because we know that it could be politically influenced. We do know, we have coped with we are aware of those difficulties, but you ask me a question, so I do strongly believe that the agents of change are them. But for example, in Italy today, so I very practical end, we're also trying to bring on with us the 11 managers of the Italian state-owned enterprises. They're so much more ahead. Culturally, they're so much ready to listen to Carol and Kevin and Ian than what many other private entrepreneurs are, because they still believe in the public interest. So if we could involve them tomorrow in a mission strategy where there are local actors and they are given the chance to contrast the big powers, they would help our ideas. Yes, I do believe so.
Right, and there, as we're coming up to 12 noon, we've got to pause, stop, and thank you, Fabrizio, for that energetic presentation. I think it's really demonstrated, if you put your presentation together with Rachel's, that social democratic revisionism, thinking and practice, is alive and well today. It's been very interesting to put an English politician and an Italian thinker together. I think one of the most interesting things that I've got out of today's presentations is that the problems are common and shared in different West European countries, but that we are really, to an extent, even with the EU, thinking and acting upon them in national compartments. And one of the things I think today we've tried to do is to break down the national compartments, to begin to introduce an English-speaking audience to the DD, and hopefully to introduce the DD to a bit of foundational thinking. And one of the things I would hope would come out of this morning's conversation, I know that there are people in, for example, in progressive positions in the SPD in Germany, is more cross-European conversation about centrist, radical, progressive, revisionist thinking. Thank you very much, Fabrizio, and all our attendees. An excellent morning. Thank you and goodbye.